strap yourselves in for this one, because this might be a bit of a long one. we once again turn our attention to conservative home, and oh my word, I've said this before. I think people often say, why do we look at conservative home? I've said it every single time we sort of cover conservative home. Conservative home is massively influential in like the non-parliamentary Conservative Party, massively so. So checking in on what like the conservative sort of thought is at that particular time is incredibly good to just to see what they're thinking, you know. And of course, as Napoleon obviously infamously said, never interrupt your enemy while they're making a mistake. So I think it's worth every so often we get to see fun articles when it comes to this. And today we've got the answer, because as you know, one of the big things of Brexit was that we were going to become this incredible free trade nation. It will be free trade all the way. And as Jacob Rees-Mogg once infamously said, well, what we'll do is we'll solve this issue by just lowering our tariff to zero. And somehow everyone else will follow this. But again, as we've talked about before, it's based on this very, very bizarre notion of what happened in history that the Victorians did. Again, this lowering of tariffs to zero only lasted 6 years before even then they realized actually this is quite a dumb idea. This isn't really helping us out as an economy, and it's sort of really since then put the kibosh on any of this free market fundamentalism. But try as they might, they've always been there, pushing ever more for these crazy ideas. So today we have an article that purports to have solved the problem of protectionism for the UK, and how we cannot get sucked in by the EU or the US somehow. But you can already tell this is going to be fun, because again, I know what's coming. You don't, at least yet. But wait for it, because oh boy, is this going to be fun? So before we do go into this, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one after today's called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And I'm certainly going to need one after this, probably something a bit stronger. But there's also the YouTube thank you button. And of course, the Pony Club down below you can join as well, which is another sort of subscription thing you can do on YouTube. And of course, do remember, leave your comments down below what you think going through all this as well, because this is, well, it's fun. It's fun. I'll let you guys describe, or choose the perfect word to describe this article in a bit. But yes, let's go diving in today and see how Stephen Booth intends to solve the problem of protectionism around the world. Let's go into this one. So, as always, this comes from Conservative Home with the title of Stephen Booth, America, the EU, and Protectionism. How can Britain avoid being caught in the crossfire? So, be careful what you wish for. For years, particularly under Donald Trump, Europeans have complained about the US's lack of urgency in meeting the challenges of climate change and the transition to greener energy. Well, now, Joe Biden's administration is serious about it and has put sizable sums of money where its mouth is. But Washington's new interventionism process signals a significant challenges to its allies, including the UK, who traditionally look to the US to uphold a, quote, relatively free trade and open trading system. Not really true. I mean, under Donald Trump increased protectionism in US when it came to the trade policy massively. I mean, the steel tariffs that the US is still keeping on us because of the situation in Northern Ireland hasn't really helped UK steel producers with the US's protectionism, partly because they are a far bigger market. And as we've said, when it comes to economic things like this, unfortunately, bigger markets, they tend to win rather than the smaller ones. Except, of course, if you're Iceland and you can threaten to pull out of NATO, which then gets America on your side, which then forces the UK to lose the Cod Wars. And remember, that happened 3 times. So bear that in mind. Iceland might be the exception to that, but overwhelmingly, that tends to be the case. So, back to it. So the Inflation Reduction Act is part of the biggest shakeup in US industrial policy for decades. It has a far-reaching consequences, both economically and politically. Signed into law last summer, the IRA has very little to do with lowering the US cost of living, but accompanies a $396 billion worth, worth of tax credits and subsidies designed to stimulate the US's green technology and electric vehicle industries. Gee, I wonder, could the UK maybe do something similar like that? I don't know. Who knows what you might call it? It could be almost a leveling up initiative. Of course, the Tories could have done this. Not only could they do this, but most of you who follow this channel know I have talked at length many, many times how if we were to really boost the British steel industry, we could go to a decarbonized steel industry. We could go that and go in that direction. And it would take a long time. I think, from what I remember reading about it, and sort of the experts have talked about it, they say it's roughly about 25 years it would take. But that would also be 25 years worth of investment the UK government would need to make into the steel industry. But once it's done that, the UK would be the first country in the world to be producing carbon neutral steel, which would be massive, absolutely massive. But do the Conservatives do this, which would be such an easy win for them to do, by the way? No, of course, they don't do that because they're not into that type of stuff, unless they want to be, and then they're usually not on board for it fully. But anyway, back to it. So, this is just part of a suite of recent policies, including the Infrastructure Investment and the Jobs Act and the Chips and Science Act, which are providing sizable subsidies for domestic manufacturing. Together, these initiatives will provide an estimated $650 billion worth of investments. Again, gee, if only the UK government would be willing to do something similar. Again, the UK government, the Tory government, has every opportunity to be able to do this. Now, Labour have talked about doing this and talked about doing it seriously. So that's the massive difference that we see between the two parties on this. So, driven by the by the bipartisan political response to geopolitical and technological competition with China, these policies have a strong Buy American element, designed to reconnect America with the American working class, which has turned decisively against globalization of the late 20th century. Oh, again, so has the British working class. As a lot of people said, a lot of the reason people in certainly the North and the working class communities voted for Brexit was because they wanted less globalism. And at the time, the Brexiteers were very, very happy to promise that with huge, ridiculous promises of, oh, don't worry, if you reinvest in, if you vote for Brexit, we can reinvest in British industry and we can bring back British manufacturing. Have we seen anything like that happen? Have we seen any proposals, any initiatives to make that happen? No, not one. So back to it. The drive to onshore manufacturing and investment is fueling the anxiety amongst the US's trade partners and allies in Asia and Europe, including the UK. The biggest source of contention is that in many cases of these new subsidies require reciprocants to be its manufacturers or consumers to meet local context thresholds. For example, a tax credit of up to $75,000 is available for buyers of electric or hydrogen powered vehicles, but to be eligible for the full tax credit, the EV must be made in North America, and specific percentages of its components must be extracted or processed in the US or countries with a trade agreement with the US. Gee, if only we were part of a trading bloc that might maybe do something similar to protect our industries and car manufacturing, and would also be at the moment be seriously gearing up for a big similar investment packages into industries in the future, mainly green industries of the future. Gee, if only we were part of that organization. Anyway, it continues. The White House says the package is not part of a zero-sum threat to its allies and argues that the package will drive down global emissions and lower the cost of green technologies elsewhere. However, the US's partners remain to be convinced. Japan, South Korea, the EU, and the UK have all expressed concerns about the new US approach. In December, Emmanuel Macron described the IRA as a super aggressive for our companies, warning that Washington policies will fragment the West. This week, the UK's Kemi Badenoch labels the IRA a protectionism and warned that it would reduce resilience of constraining supply chains in the US. Well, guess what, Kemi? Unfortunately, the US will not listen to the UK. We are nothing in terms of an economy compared to the US economy. We're just not that important. And maybe Kemi Badenoch, now that she's got that business element back in her sort of department once again, maybe she should be looking at ways she can boost UK green industry so that they can compete. Because overall, as we've said, a lot of these free market fundamentalists view protectionism as a bit of a dirty word, but there's nothing wrong with a bit of protectionism now and again. Countries shouldn't overly go into protectionism, but there's nothing wrong with a bit of protectionism now and again, sort of protecting developing industries or making sure that industries don't have to compete against, being swamped by loads of cheap foreign imports. We've seen Brompton Pikes, a big Brexit supporter, was worried that after Brexit, it would now have to compete with all these really cheap Chinese bicycles that have been flooding the market. And they've been open and complaining about that and trying to lobby the British government about that for years, since 2018, I believe it was. So, yeah, hasn't really worked out for them. And, of course, the UK government ain't interested in that because, protectionist, can't do that. Anyway, a legal challenge at the World Trade Organization would only raise the political temperature and is likely to be fruitless. South Korea's trade minister, Do Ken-an, has called on the EU, the UK, and others to cooperate in a diplomatic push to persuade the US to amend its rules. However, any adjustments are likely to be minor, since the legislation it specifies amounts, timelines, conditions in detail. Equally, US policymakers would be forgiven for pointing out that the EU has its own protectionist policies in place, particularly for electric vehicles designed to onshore production within the single market. Again, this is really not a problem at the end of the day. It's the US investing in the US. Is it engaging in a bit of protectionism? Yes, absolutely. But there's nothing wrong with the US doing that. It is not complete protectionism. And it's something that the UK and especially the Tories probably going to find out very quickly about this. And of course, just as we cannot influence the US policy on this, we ain't going to be able to persuade the EU to change its policies on electric vehicles either. So this is an argument that there has been an overreaction on the part of the US. Critics, particularly in the EU, and headline figures may be eye-watering, but the US economy is huge, and the spending will be carried out over a 10-year time horizon. Equally, there is a logic to the argument that if the US investment brings down the cost of green technologies, other countries will benefit too. However, those arguments are difficult to make for a politician who sees investment by European companies being diverted to the US, and Europe is also considering, with the fallout from the Ukraine war, which has pushed up energy crisis, costing to cost relative to the US. So this is it. We see more and more governments being more and more subsidy friendly, but you've got to remember the Conservatives are not subsidy friendly unless it's, well, maybe they've got certain business interests. But hey, um, but we are seeing more and more countries going back to looking at subsidies and looking at how they can use subsidies to rebuild manufacturing bases that have been lost in many of these countries. So it's not just the US and Europe that are doing this. This is happening around the world. Um, we are seeing a bit more the sort of a turn away from the globalization and this free market, fundamentalism, certainly in trade policy, back to more certainly, continuing free trade, but there's an element of protectionism. And as we've said before, protectionism isn't a dirty word. And it can be for some countries a very good thing to help protect, jobs in those countries and, of course, manufacturing. So, therefore, the pressure for the EU to join the subsidies race is increasing, particularly from those countries that have always wanted the looser state aid rules. Particularly last month, it was France's finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, who said there is no time to lose in establishing a new European industrial policy to support green industry and encouraging industries to relocate to European territory. It seems a long time ago that Brussels was insisting that the UK be bound to the level playing field rules and state aid in the UK-EU trade and cooperation agreement. Well, yeah. Guess what? If Europe loosens those deals, then I probably would suspect in the level playing field agreement, those would probably loosen as well and allow us to engage in a bit of, subsidization. But of course, you've got to remember this guy's a conservative economist, and subsidies to these type of people are a complete anathema to their own well-being. What government subsidizing an industry? What is this? Socialism? So, at the start of the month, the European Commission tabled its Green Deal industrial plan. Again, no problem with that. Hey, if Europe wants to do that, it's free to do that. And, if we were part of the EU, we would be part of that as well. But saying that relaxing its state aid restrictions would, quote, enhance the competitiveness of Europeans' net zero industry and support a faster transition to climate neutrality. With the EU lacking its own significant funding schemes, many smaller EU member states are concerned that loosening the state aid rules will simply favour those with the deepest pockets, being France and Germany, and will undermine the competition within the single market. Again, valid complaint, but then again, France and Germany have always had a massive, stake in the single market. But again, so were we. Like I say, we were known as the big three, being UK, France, and Germany. But of course, we're no longer in there. And it's kind of funny that people forget that many of these small European countries would rely on us being a lot more free market centric to sort of balance out France and Germany. And of course, we're no longer in there now. So we've lost a lot of influence, which we always said we would lose once we're out of the EU. And now we're out of the EU. It's not like we have any say in the EU, so we can't be a balancing factor in that, because why has the EU got to listen to us? It hasn't at all. So taken together, this is a clear risk that the UK will be caught in a crossfire of a race to protectionism between the US and the EU. This week, Jeremy Hunt acknowledged that the IRA presented a very real and competitive threat. Nothing that the UK could not complete a subsidy race that he added. That's not a time that is going to be easy for us to access the GDP equivalent to $369 billion. And we could. That's the thing. We wouldn't be able to maybe match that, but we could do our own subsidy program that would benefit the UK. But of course, we are having and we have seen a big loss in trade, a big loss in sort of tax revenue. Um, so, but of course, I wonder why that happened. So, with resources limited, the UK will need to systematically prioritize the interventions it does make. For example, if the UK is serious about being a global player in the electric car industry, there needs to be an urgent and strategic approach in supporting an investment in battery manufacturing. Well, they had that with UK Volt, but the government just completely let that fall apart completely. Whoops. So, while we should not be naive about the changes underway to globalization as we knew it, the UK should work its partners via groupings such as the Transpacific Partnership. Again, it's so bizarre to see conservatives talk about this because we were in a grouping, a very good economic grouping that was on our doorstep, and this raises huge questions because there's no guarantee we're going to be let into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, let alone why those countries in the Trans-Pacific Partnership would change the rules to benefit the UK, which is halfway round the world. There are still huge questions to be asked whether us actually joining that is going to be any benefit to us whatsoever. Not only that, but the way in which this guy is talking about using this group is the exact same way that the Tories moaned and complained about the EU for years. So, to illustrate that trade and cooperation among like-minded countries can provide an alternative to protectionism, that, quote, friendly shoring is better than onshoring. And of course, depends what your nature of friendly shoring is. We have seen years manufacturers basically do runners to far cheaper countries because that's been the better, cheaper alternative. Unfortunately, that's just been capitalism and indeed the race to massive globalization that unfortunately we've seen throughout the years. And conservatives in particular have gone along with the globalization narrative for years. So part of the problem that he's even talking about is because of their race to this. Not only that, friendly shoring better than onshoring. Well, what do you mean friendly shoring? What if a UK business decides to pick up 500 jobs and take it somewhere else? That's 500 jobs that's no longer in the UK. Whereas if you're onshoring, not only are you having shorter supply chains, because remember, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is halfway around the world, and we've seen, certainly because of the pandemic, that shorter supply chains are better. This still raises the in argument that if you're so desperate to be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all those exact same benefits of joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership are not only there for us rejoining the Single Market Customs Union, the EU, but they are far, far more better and will be a lot more better for the UK to participate in rather than the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So, if possible, and an acceptable deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol could be the catalyst. This includes improving the relationship with our European partners. The UK would benefit from a reduction to the post-Brexit friction in UK-EU supply chains and evading any new European moves towards protectionism. Again, I think he means regulation. Like I say, most of these conservative Brexiteers and conservative economists use protectionism and regulation very interchangeably, quite sneaky. So I think that's generally what he might actually mean, rather than, or at least maybe lumping in those regulations with protectionism, because we see that all the time. But anyway, let's finish this off. So meanwhile, the UK's to have much to offer Europe. The UK remains the continent's tech capital. The UK boasts 4 universities in the Times Higher Education top 25 rankings. The EU has none, although again, I think it depends. I don't really see how the Times higher education ranking top 25 really has a a massive thing. But again, I think that's just intellectual elitism. Uh, then again, I thought Brexiteers were against that, but hey, there you go. Capital markets in the UK are roughly twice as deep and relative to the GDP as the rest of the EU. Probably not for long because that capital's been moving over to the EU for quite some while. So I don't know whether those deep pockets are still there. And of course, better access to these markets can improve the EU's ability to support growth and finance and investment. Again, not when all those assets are moving to the EU, as we've seen for the past couple of years. More importantly, the UK needs to offer a sustainable policy and regulatory environment to encourage inward investment. Again, what do you mean by this and this regulatory environment? We have seen when Conservatives have put these changes forwards, they are far, far less than what people would actually want. You know, the Working Time Directive, the Tories would love to get rid of that. They would absolutely love to get rid of that. Not only that, we've also seen the new 4-day work week, the whole big data that's coming from that companies that did a 4-day work week were even more productive. Do you think that the Tories are going to initiate a move to a 4-day work week? Don't think so. Don't think so at all. So to encourage more inward investment, dear me, including to developing a more agile regulatory framework, what did I just say, for emerging technologies. The world has changed significantly since 2016, and the UK must up its game to ensure that it is equipped to compete. Well, yeah, if anything, it's showing that, yeah, leaving the EU was a very bad idea, both certainly not only just politically, but economically as well. We're having a ton of economic problems, not only just here in the UK, but around the UK. And you've only got to look at the data. If you exclude London and you compare Northern Ireland to any other region, again, exclude London because, London's London. Northern Ireland, for some reason, is doing far, far better than the rest of these other counties, countries, areas in the UK. Why is that? I would love to ask this guy, Stephen Booth, that question. Like, why does he think that is the case? Because there's only one real, clear, obvious answer to that: is that Northern Ireland is still in the single market customs union, and it is benefiting from that. And we have seen businesses in Northern Ireland talk continuously how they love having sort of the best of both worlds. But yeah, yet another bizarre and strange solution from Conservative Home. And bear in mind, there are arguments in there you could use that he has made for rejoining the EU. He talks about, again, everything that he said about, the Transpacific Partnership applies doubly so to rejoining the single market customs union and, of course, the EU. But they don't seem to understand that. And, of course, as we've said, the Transpacific Partnership looks to the EU as a model direction for where it to go. So I cannot wait, because they've already started talking about these countries of setting up a Trans-Pacific Partnership court. So I'd love to see what happens when the Brexiteers are going to flip out and they find out that there's a Trans-Pacific Partnership court in there that's going to deal with all the trade disputes, because they hate the European one. So who knows what they're going to think to that one. So yeah, so yes, as always, pardon me. As always, thank you very much for watching. Leave your comments down below. Tell me what you thought about this. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, we'll see you all next time.